Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be jumping right back into our ongoing retrospective look at Spawn with Spawn number 42. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in February of 1996, we can see here what I would not blame anyone for thinking is a Todd McFarlane / Greg Capullo cover. However, it's not. It's in fact a Tony Daniel Kevin Conrad cover. And this is the point where we see Tony really trying to basically kind of stick with the exact same type of art style. Not completely exact, but pretty close to what Greg was doing at this time with Spawn, which makes sense in terms of giving the character and the book as a whole one cohesive artistic feel. Now, there is one specific way, well, two if you count the signatures down here in the bottom, but there is one specific way outside of that you can oftentimes tell the difference between the two, and that is the way that Tony draws hands. You can notice that Spawn's hand in this image is actually quite beefy and like muscular, almost animalistic and claw-like. This is a big difference from the way that he draws Spawn's hands versus the way that Greg draws them. Greg draws the fingers a little bit more elongated and slender with longer, sharper, pointier looking type of claws. It's not a huge difference, but if you look through these books enough, it's something that you will pick up on. Story, Todd McFarlane. Pencils, Tony Daniel. Inks, Kevin Conrad. Copy editor and letters, Tom Orzechowski. Color, Steve Oliff, Quinn Suppley, and Ollie Optics. The story picks up exactly where we left off in the previous issue after we saw Curse's castle explode. This was not good for Spawn as he was inside of that explosion as well. However, his costume was able to think faster than he did and reacted in a manner needed to protect him as it gathered all of his loose body parts and wrapped itself like a cocoon around them. It even states here that his costume basically became something with the same endurance as vanadium steel, whatever that is, but pretty strong stuff, I'd assume. Anyway, we see that Spawn, wrapped in his costume, is flying through the air at breakneck speed, red hot as it states, as we see him fall to the ground in a huge mass of just explosive force, ripping through trees and roots, skidding along the ground until it finally comes to a stop some 2 miles away from the explosion itself. As Spawn finally comes to a stop, he is then lifted off the ground by his costume, as he is in no condition to stand, as his body is still not fully reassembled after being cut to pieces by Curse in his laboratory. We see here that the chains are actually grabbing him and holding him up along with the effort of the cape itself, as Spawn tries to get his bearings and figure out exactly what his next move should be. We're then teleported to somewhere in Connecticut where Twitch Williams lives. We see his home outside. Actually a pretty nice place given that he's working on a police officer's salary. Granted, he's a detective, so he makes a little bit more money, but still, this is a pretty solid house for a guy who's on a government paycheck. He and Sam are going over all of the evidence that they've accumulated against Chief Banks, linking him to Billy Kincaid and the murder of Senator Jennings' daughter. And at this point, they're quite certain that Chief Banks not only let Kincaid go when he should have remained in police custody, but also potentially steered him in the direction of the senator's daughter for reasons of intimidation and perhaps a way to gain control over a government official. As the conversation continues, Twitch and Sam start to realize that one part of this mystery which doesn't make sense is that Billy Kincaid was allowed to live after he carried out the kidnapping and murder of the senator's daughter. And that seems like a real loose end. However, Sam and Twitch come to the realization that they may have been keeping him around as an insurance policy for making sure that someone who was involved in this plot kept their mouth shut. As plausible as this is, they still also can't figure out how Spawn figures into this. They can't figure out exactly how he got his hands on all of the information in the file that he gave to them. And they do come to the realization, though, that that's not exactly super important in terms of making sure that they get all of the rest of the evidence they need in this case. And at this point, they need to focus their efforts on figuring out exactly how the CIA ties to Chief Banks and getting their hands on evidence that can prove that. At this point, however, their conversation is interrupted by Twitch's impossibly beautiful wife as she informs Twitch that she's going out for a run. Twitch states, yeah, that's fine, and we see that she's wearing cutoff jean shorts, which are not exactly what I would call appropriate activewear. However, this is Tony just trying to draw her in a incredibly skimpy, sexy outfit to once again illustrate that Twitch's wife is impossibly beautiful given exactly what he looks like. But we also see that Sam is completely infatuated with her to the point that once she shows up, he's so enamored by looking at her that he completely tones out everything that's being said between Twitch and her, to the point where Twitch asks him a question directly and he simply states, "Sorry, I wasn't listening." We're then teleported back to West Virginia as we see a young boy running through the night with a small sack as he tries to make his way into a place that he can lose the people who are chasing him. The young boy in question is named Pat Shaughnessy, and he lives in Cerrado, West Virginia, which is in fact a real town on the western side of the state, along the banks of the Ohio River, for anyone who's wondering. He is doing his best to evade being caught by the three school bullies that torment him all the time and beat him up and try to steal his comics after he buys them each week. He manages to hide from them, but he is concerned that he's bent or perhaps folded a corner on one of his new comic books, so he decides to take a look at all of them. However, he wants to get to his hideout before this happens. At this point, though, he is a little bit surprised when he goes to open the door and is suddenly attacked by Spawn's costume as his cape and chains blast through the door and grab the young boy, suspending him in air as the child immediately gives up, stating, "Please don't hurt me, I'll do anything." At this point, Spawn's costume realizes that Pat is no threat whatsoever and sets him back down on the ground. However, Spawn is rather upset by this as he pleads with the young boy to leave, stating, "You have to get out of here. I can't control it. It may hurt you." He then looks at the boy again, stating, "Are you not listening? In fact, I may hurt you. I don't have control." This, however, is something that piques young Patrick's interest as he realizes that Spawn's costume is alive, just like that of Venom. And this is the first time we've seen Venom referenced in the pages of Spawn in terms of his name actually being spelled out. In fact, Tony even took the time to draw the base of his speech bubble in the melting type of pattern that we saw in the pages of Spider-Man when Venom first showed up. And he's rather excited being confronted with what he believes is a real-life superhero. However, Spawn quickly corrects him, stating, "I'm not really quite a superhero, kid." The young boy then starts to pull all of his comic books out of his knapsack and is rather excited at meeting a real-life superhero, asking Spawn if he's part of a team or not, and Spawn's not really sure how to respond to this. And he states, a team like X-Men or Youngblood. And this is where things start to get a little weird as the young boy starts to explain that the Image comic book company apparently exists in Spawn's reality. However, he's not part of it. But he even brings up the existence of, like I said, Youngblood and also the Savage Dragon comic book, which we even see a poster of Savage Dragon along the wall, accompanied by one of the Incredible Hulk and what is probably like X-Factor or something, I think maybe over here, and Superman up in the corner. At this point, he starts to ramble on, stating, "I love all these comic books so much. I'm a big fan of X-Men. Unfortunately, there's too many titles to keep up with, and I really like X-Force, but it's not as good since Tony Daniel stopped drawing it," which, of course, is just a little inside joke. He then starts to open them up and read through his books, and then he asks Spawn once again, "So are you part of a team?" Spawn says no, and Pat says, well, that's okay. There's plenty of independent superheroes that, kind of just do their own thing, like Spider-Man and Batman. Have you seen the movies? And Spawn's like, wait a minute, what movies? He's like, yeah, there's like 3 Batman movies. How could you have not seen them? Spawn then explains that he's been away for a while and that he just hasn't had the opportunity to catch up. However, Pat says that's okay, you can watch them whenever you want, and then explains to him that he's also trying to become a superhero as he lifts up his shirt to show off his superhero costume underneath, and explains that his superhero name is the Terrorizer. He then asks Spawn what the emblem on his chest stands for, and Spawn says nothing, and Patrick says, no, it has to stand for something. Come on, everybody's got one. As we can see, there's a T with a lightning bolt on his t-shirt underneath his overshirt. Pat continues on, stating, to me, that mark on your chest looks like a big M. And I also was wondering, what are your powers? Spawn tells him he doesn't know, and Pat responds stating, it's kind of weird that you don't know what your powers are. Did someone give them to you? Spawn responds that, yes, it was somebody named Mabulja. And Pat states, well, that's a pretty funny name, but it does start with an M. At this point, Spawn tries to brush him off, stating, you don't know what you're talking about, kid. And Pat responds with an interesting question as he asks, well, did this Mabulja guy give someone else powers? And Spawn responds by stating, yeah, he did. And then Pat asks, well, does he have that same mark? And at this point, Spawn does realize that the Violator, when he's in his human clown form, his face paint does distinctly make an M symbol very reminiscent of the one on Spawn's chest. And Spawn realizes, in fact, that it is an M and that he bears the mark of the Mabulja. He even says so out loud, which Pat says, see, I told ya. And then he puts on his mask and states, so what do you think? Pretty cool, huh? He's like, but I need to know exactly what do I need to do to become a real hero? And at this point, Spawn kind of jokingly says, kid, if I knew the answer to that question, I probably wouldn't be hanging out here by myself in a barn, would I? And Pat concedes that's probably true. At this point, Spawn tries to reason with him a little bit, stating, being a hero isn't really about capes and costumes. It's about your actions and how you use them. At this point, Pat sits down a little bit depressed and states that Spawn sounds like his father and that he wants to try and do good, but he's the class geek and is constantly bullied at school and has no friends, and the only people who seem to like him are the teachers, but that's not really, what he's looking for in life. Spawn sits down and tries to be a little bit more understanding of the young boy, stating that, I understand that you're in a very tough position now, but eventually you're going to have to stand up for yourself, because the only way that we can ever confront the evil that we deal with in our lives is to actually meet it head on. We can't keep running from our problems forever, and if we don't face them, we're never going to actually solve any of them. Pat concedes that Spawn may be correct, but he's a little bit worried about how all that's going to happen. He then goes on to ask Spawn a different line of questions as he wonders if Spawn has a girlfriend. Spawn states yes, as he fondly remembers his former wife, and this piques Pat's interest as he states, well, listen, I've got girl troubles too. There's a girl at school that I really like a lot, but she doesn't even know I exist, and I don't know what to do in order to get her attention or to talk to her or even, get her to acknowledge that I exist in the first place. Meanwhile, back in New York City, we are brought to the home of Granny Blake, where Wanda, Spawn's former wife and Granny Blake's granddaughter, is delivering groceries to her elderly blind grandmother. Granny Blake asks about how things are going with the children's wing at the hospital, and Wanda explains that they're going phenomenally. The anonymous donor that dropped off a huge sum of cash money was imperative in getting all of the funding they needed for the wing of the hospital, and they'll probably never know who this person was as they left no note or any way to contact them. Granny Blake believes that this was just some good Samaritan. However, we know through past issues that this is very much probably having to do with Jason Wynn and the plan that the Violator has for not necessarily just Spawn, but all of the people around him. Wanda then asks Granny how she's doing given everything that was going on with her tax situation, and she states that somehow everything just miraculously worked out and that she's been, had all of her debts taken care of, all of the taxes have worked out, and she's even gotten more money in her pension. They believe that this is just a string of good fortune, but they don't know the underlying plot that exists against them, as the Violator is trying his best to go after Spawn through the people that he cares about. We then see that Wanda suddenly starts to cough, and Granny asks if she's okay, and Wanda states that it's probably just stress from dealing with everything that's going on with the CIA and Terry's work, and she doesn't let Granny know about the quest that she and Terry have to try and figure out exactly what happened to cause all of the uproar that nearly got him killed. But we can see here that this is starting to wear on her and that this might be a precursor for something bad that's coming down the pike. We're then suddenly teleported to an undisclosed location where we see Cy-Gor standing alone in the night on a rock outcropping, and he looks upon a small town. He realizes that this is not New York City, and he's going to have to keep searching for said city. We don't know at this point exactly what is motivating Cy-Gor to go to New York. In his mind, it states that New York City is the place that holds the answers that he's looking for, but we don't know what any of those answers are. This is the first point in which we're really getting any kind of insight to Cy-Gor having some sort of ulterior character motivation that's driving him in the direction that he's going. Prior to this, it was more so inferred that he was just kind of aimlessly wandering around. But we now know that he is in fact headed to New York and is most likely on a collision course with Spawn or some other characters that exist in this series. But for now, it's going to remain mysterious, as he simply looks and believes that New York must be just beyond the clouds, as he doesn't really know exactly where he is or exactly how far he has to travel, but he knows where he wants to get to. Meanwhile, back in the city, we see that Sam and Twitch are trying late at night to break into Chief Banks' office to potentially secure the hard evidence that they need to figure out exactly what the connection between Banks and the CIA is. However, they're having a hard time breaking the lock when, unexpectedly, another officer approaches from behind with a set of keys in his hand, saying, "I think this is what you guys are looking for." The two of them are shocked, but he says, you guys shouldn't be so surprised. The entire department knows that the two of you are at war with Chief Banks, and everyone's picking sides. But me, myself, I'm just out for self-preservation. And you might be wondering who exactly this officer is. Yeah, I was wondering that myself, and I'll be honest, I have no idea. He's not named in this issue, and I went back through the 41 issues prior to this to try and see if there was any picture of this officer, if his name was ever mentioned, and I couldn't find anything. I mean, I guess there's the potential that maybe he showed up in the Blood Feud miniseries and I just don't remember, but he doesn't look familiar, and as far as I know, this is his first appearance, just showing up out of the blue, helping Sam and Twitch, and we're just supposed to take it all on face value, I guess. The officer in question then goes on to explain to Sam and Twitch that he, like them, has recently incurred Chief Banks' wrath and has been informed that his services will no longer be needed as he prepares to clean out his office. Sam then asks, well, what exactly are those keys hiding? He responds by stating, well, that depends entirely on what you're looking for. All I know is that inside of his office, there's a filing cabinet that is not usually locked that may contain what you're trying to find. Twitch then asks, why exactly are you helping us? And the officer goes on to explain that it is indeed self-preservation, as he believes that as long as Chief Banks is chasing them, he won't be keeping an eye on this officer who is trying to get as far away from all of this as possible, as he seems to know a lot more than he's letting on and believes that Chief Banks is only one piece of this puzzle And there are some very powerful people involved in all this that could make his life very, very difficult. He then leaves, and Sam and Twitch enter Chief Banks' office and immediately go to the filing cabinet. Twitch finds a file that seems to give them all they need, as they find records of a courier service that is making movements from the CIA to various financial institutions several times a day, and it all starts at the moment that Senator Jennings' daughter is murdered. At this point, they believe they have everything they need to take down Chief Banks and also tie him to someone in the CIA as well, as Sam even notes that Billy Kincaid was really just a tool that they were using the entire time, and that the rest of them are going to be very uncomfortable once the two of them bring all of this evidence to light. Back in West Virginia, we see that Pat has finally decided to head home for the evening as he starts to walk to his house. Unfortunately, the bullies who were chasing him before have been lying in wait, getting ready to strike the moment they found him, and as soon as he walks by, one of them punches him square across the face. The three bullies jump him, trying to grab him, beat him up, and steal his comic books. However, Pat is feisty enough that he's able to get free as one of the bullies tries to grab his shirt. It tears away, revealing his costume underneath. Pat immediately puts on his mask, turns around, and decides to take Spawn's advice and confront his bullies, stating that they're all a bunch of jerks and that he's tired of being pushed around. The bullies all seem terrified as one of them says, "Look at his eyes, I can't believe it, oh my god, what are we going to do?" At this point, Pat believes that he has the upper hand and that Spawn's advice is working, as he tells them, "Oh, you can't stand it when someone finally stands up to you. Well, who's first? Let's do it." But what he doesn't realize is that they aren't talking about him. Spawn is standing directly behind young Patrick, and the boys are terrified at what they're seeing as this monstrous, green, glowing-eyed, chain and spike-covered individual is very intimidating, and they're not certain how all this is going to play out. Unfortunately for the bullies, Spawn's costume has once again taken it upon itself to start doing its own actions of its own volition, and it immediately reaches out and grabs all three of the bullies. Pat is furious, not realizing that Spawn had followed him, and he is upset, stating, "You've made me look like a fool now. You told me to go out and handle my problems, but now you're doing all of it yourself, and now no one's ever going to respect me. You need to put them down. You're hurting all of them." But Spawn is not able to do this as his costume is basically out of control at this point. Pat is raging at this point as he starts to attack Spawn, hitting him and using fake karate moves, I guess, as he seems to be chopping him in the leg, as he screams at him to stop and put them down. "Why did you do this? Why did you follow me?" But Spawn protests, stating, "I'm not the one who followed you. It was the costume. I can't control it." At this point, Pat just screams at him, "No, no more. You have to stop. Put him down." And then he jumps between Spawn and the bullies, telling him to stop and sit down. The costume seems to respond to this, as suddenly Spawn collapses to the ground and the costume releases all three of the bullies. Pat tells them all to run home and get away. They immediately just take his advice and say, "Come on, let's get out of here." As we see the moon rising over the small town, and we find out through the narration box that the boys' parents, after hearing the story, kind of just chalked it all up to a spat between young boys. And since no one was seriously injured, they didn't seem to believe anything was all that wrong, and just thought that the whole idea of this caped monster superhero guy was just vivid imaginations, as they just basically told the boys to stop screwing around and even grounded a few of them. The next day at school, we see Pat sitting lonely by himself as a young girl slowly approaches him. She suddenly asks him, "Hey, Pat, I don't know if you know who I am," and he interrupts her, stating, "Pam Williams, oh my goodness, I'm pleased to meet you." She then sits down and talks about how amazing she thinks Pat is, stating that the whole school knows about how he saved the other three boys from a monster, and she thinks he's just dreamy. and was really hoping if he would go to the Sadie Hawkins dance with her. And of course, Pat is absolutely head over heels for this girl and decides that he's going to take her up on her offer as the two of them sit down and have a wonderful conversation to what might be a cute little relationship. However, there's just one problem with all of this, and that's the fact that Pat is 9 years old, and this is taking place in an elementary school. I am not aware of any elementary school ever that has Sadie Hawkins dances for, 9-year-old kids who are in 3rd or 4th grade. This is crazy. I don't know. I know Todd grew up in Canada, and maybe this is something that happens in the Great White North commonly, but as far as I'm aware, no Sadie Hawkins dance is happening for children of this age group as we reach the end of the story. We then get to image info, and this one's a little different. It's not about upcoming comic books. It's just a little bit of a rundown of things that were going on with Terry Fitzgerald. We see a picture of him, Todd, and Bo Smith sitting together at Todd's house, just having some fun. There's then a picture of the Spawn hockey team, which, dude, these hockey jerseys are sick. I mean, I don't know if you care about hockey. I don't know if you care that much about Spawn. I'd assume so if you're watching the video at this point. But dude, I would totally rock one of these jerseys if they were for sale. These things are awesome. Now, obviously, these are all for children, so none of them would fit me. But Todd, you gotta put Spawn hockey jerseys up for sale on your website again. We then get some other images. This one here of Terry working in his home office, which is just an absolute wreck. Now, Terry does explain that normally his office is not in this bad of a shape. This is simply because of the fact that he had been working on a billion different things that week, and it was just nonstop go, 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 and he didn't have time to clean anything up. And this one down here in the bottom is of Paul Burke just on vacation in Arizona. I don't know why this one got included, but I think Terry just thought it was a funny looking picture, so he decided to put it in the comic. Whatever, man. It's your comic. Do you. You're one of the editors, so if Todd had wanted you to not do this, he wouldn't have given you the authority to do so. We then reach the spawning ground, which is the portion of the comic book where fan letters are printed and responded to by Todd directly. Most of the letters in this month's issue focus around people either not liking the storytelling or becoming impatient with it. Many of them bringing up that it feels disjointed with the multiple storylines all going on at the same time. How characters like the Freak and Cy-Gor feel like they were just kind of inserted and don't necessarily make sense in the overall story arc of Spawn, and that there's nothing necessarily wrong with the characters, they just seem out of place in this story. One reader even brings up that he doesn't like the direction that the toy line's going in, and Todd's response is mostly kind of stating that they need to kind of stick with the story to see where he's taking things. But he does admit at one point that because of them switching to the bi-weekly release date for the past few months, which is something they had done at this time, it was making it difficult to have all of the stories line up together. Now, this is due to the fact that he's having one book that is being penciled by Greg Capullo and inked by himself, and another book that's being drawn by Tony Daniel and inked by Kevin Conrad. So this is creating a weird dichotomy where he's having to try and, keep up with the artwork with one book and make sure that the story coincides with the next book that's being taken care of by a different art team. And the whole thing is just kind of getting away from him, which is one of the reasons he does state in this letter section that they're going back to the monthly release schedule, which personally, I never understood why he tried to go to this bi-weekly release schedule for that period of time. It seems kind of just unnecessary, especially when you're asking people to buy 2 issues of your book a month to keep up with the story, and it just seems like you're trying to rush things along. And case in point, the story of this issue seemed a little disjointed at points where it just didn't have a natural flow to it. The whole storyline with Pat is kind of a one-off thing, as was the Christmas issue. And some of it feels like Todd's just coming up with a little bit of filler here and there. Now, we did get some interesting story points with Sam and Twitch, but the overall story revolving directly around Spawn just seemed kind of pasted on and almost secondary in a lot of ways. There's another interesting letter where a reader talks about how he doesn't like what Todd's done with his toy line and believes that he's charging too much and all these other things, and that things are being made in China for pennies. And he knows this because he's a Chinese citizen himself and understands the way that the business world there works. But Todd goes on to explain that, yes, while I can't produce the toys for cheap there, I still have to ship them across the Pacific Ocean and get them into the US, which is a whole nother cost, then get them onto the shelves of retailers. And that by the time the toy gets sold, he's not making a whole lot of profit per unit. It's more him working on the economy of scale. So the reality is the prices are set very much so at the bare minimum for what he needs to be a profitable company, which is something I think a lot of people don't understand in terms of large scale business that's trying to operate at a nationwide level. The profit margin on individual products usually is not very high. It's just that when you combine that profit of, hundreds of thousands or millions of units sold, it becomes a really big number. And for a new company, which Todd Toys, or I'm sorry, at this point, McFarlane Toys would have been, only having existed for a couple of years, they would have been really right on the edge of, okay, we have to make exactly this much money to remain afloat and profitable and keep going forward. So this guy's kind of, making some really bold criticisms of a very young company trying to do what it needed to do to survive, and also trying to meet the needs of its customers in terms of what it was producing. So I think the guy was a little bit out of line, and Todd actually answered that question in a very mannerly way, in my opinion. We then get this amazing 2-page pinup by Shannon Denton, Robert Lacko, and Roy Young. And I think this is fantastic. You got Spawn over here with his cape and chains going wild, busting a cap straight in the face of the Violator, who is recoiling. Violator is this entire page, basically. And while there's not really anything going on with the background, with this much action going on in the foreground, it's totally unnecessary. This is really a super cool pinup. And if the artist involved in this somehow managed to see this video, shout out to you. You really knocked this one out of the park. We then get to the end cap, which is a 2-page blurb about upcoming McFarlane toy projects. Now, this month's end cap is exactly the same as issue 41's end cap. So if you'd like to hear what my thoughts about it were, go back and watch it in that episode. There's no reason for me to repeat myself here. We then get 2 pages of Spawn Direct, one of them, of course, being the order sheet itself, the other one being advertisements for the products you could order. Nothing here really stands out except for these, the autographed, uncut Spawn Power Cards. The Spawn Power Cards were a collectible card game, and the idea that you could buy uncut sheets of them that were autographed by Todd McFarlane is really kind of a cool idea. I've never actually come across any of these Power Cards or talked to anybody who had played this game, so if you happen to be someone who did buy these cards and play this game, feel free to talk about it in the comments below, because I'd actually like to know more about this. This is kind of a big hole in my Spawn knowledge, if you will, and it's something I find somewhat intriguing. On the final page of the book, we get an advertisement for MegaCon Orlando, Florida, 1996. Shout out. I have been to multiple MegaCons, always working, never as just like a con goer, with a buddy of mine who used to own a comic book store. And shout out to when it was still in the first weekend of March. That's the days, dude. Early March was the time to have it. Boy, those years when they did it on Memorial Day weekend, those freaking stunk, dude. If you know, you know. And check this out, down at the bottom, $10 a day or a 3-day pass for $25. Can you believe how cheap it used to be to go to MegaCon? Holy crap. Or when it was just a 3-day event. Dude, I can't believe how little money it used to be to go to this. And one of these days, I got to get back down there and go to MegaCon as just a con goer, so I can have the whole weekend to float around, do whatever I want, just kind of go and check out the panels and wander around all of the dealer room and just enjoy it as a con goer instead of having to work like an absolute dog for an entire week. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Spider's Web Cards and Collectibles. Apparently, you could order from these guys and have stuff shipped all over the US. I don't know if this service was any good. I've never talked to anyone who's ever used it, and I've never used it myself. If you have any experience with Spider's Web and would like to talk about it in the comments below, feel free to do so. And that was Spawn number 42. And I gotta say, it's not the greatest issue of Spawn. The story, as I talked about earlier, feels very disjointed and almost as if it's kind of flailing in places. The most interesting part of this issue is the subplot that's going on with Sam and Twitch, as the stuff that's going on with Spawn really just feels like an afterthought as a whole. And if I'm being quite honest, a lot of the criticisms that were levied in the Spawning Ground letter section are very much on display in this issue. It does feel as though Todd was, kind of flailing about a little bit with the way that he was writing the story and the way that issues were coming out at this time. And it does feel like the narrative was suffering as a whole because of this. I honestly feel like there's nothing wrong with introducing characters like Cy-Gor and the Freak, but they needed to be brought in a more cohesive way. I stated specifically in the Freaks issue that it should have been a much slower build for that character. He should have had multiple issues of slowly gaining Spawn's trust before that issue where Spawn helps him go and murder who he claimed was the guy that killed his family. So that was a big problem. I feel like Cy-Gor is being handled all right, as they're doing exactly that in these issues, slowly introducing him a little bit at a time, issue after issue, building up towards a bigger story payoff. Unfortunately, it's so mysterious that people are kind of losing patience with it, as yeah, Cy-Gor exists, and yes, he's very dangerous, but what exactly is going on? What's his character motivation? What is he going after? And yes, the idea is that we will find that out in a future issue, but it seems so mysterious at this point that it's difficult to follow in some ways. But then again, these are all just my opinions. Your opinions may be that Todd was handling all these story issues perfectly, and that this issue was fantastic. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.